As you know, today we are talking about the massacre that occurred 80 years ago. Is the 80th anniversary. As you know, as Eddie has just explained to you, 1937, Trujillo had become president of the Dominican Republic in 1930, ordered his army to eradicate once and for all the Haitian presence from the Dominican borderland by slaughtering all Haitians living in the northern military department of the country. Estimates of the number of the victims are still disputed, 10,000, 40,000. What we do know, however, is that the execution were carried out mostly with machetes and knives to make it look like a popular insurrection. Killings began on the 28th of September, intensified on October the 2nd, and lasted until the 8th of October. Sporadic murders carried on until the 5th of November. In order to better understand the 1937 massacre, the reason why I'm saying Haitian between inverted commas, it's important to remember that up to 1936 there was no mutually recognized political divide between the Dominican Republic and Haiti. The 1936 agreement, which fixed the current line, revised the 1929 treaty, which redrew the border between the two nations while Haiti was still occupied by the United States, which had left the Dominican Republic only a few years earlier. So the United States occupation of Hispaniola accelerated, as Eddie pointed out, the rebirth of the sugarcane industry, especially in the Dominican Republic, setting the pattern for exploitation and migration of the Haitian workforce. In 1924, when the United States withdrew from Dominican territory, North American corporations owned 11 out of 21 sugar mills operating in the country. 98% of Dominican sugar exports were absorbed by the United States. So the establishment of the border was strongly encouraged by the US at the time, keen to stabilize a potentially volatile situation for their own benefit. Before 1936, however, Haitians and Dominicans often had relatives and owned properties on both sides of the border. People crossed the border every day, often more than once a day, to go to school, to go to work, to meet friends, family, to go to the market, where business transactions crucially took place half in Spanish and half in Creole. What I will do today, I'm a literature person, so I will be putting in dialogue fictional and non-fictional text, documentary, some visual performances produced as a reaction to the 1937 massacre, and more recently as responses to the ongoing process of discrimination and denationalization of Dominicans of Asian descent in the Dominican Republic, a process that some, as we will see, have called civil genocide. The text I have chosen today focus on the triangulation of massacre or civil genocide, language, and reconciliation, which is the subject of today's discussion. So first text I'll look at is Jesus Maria Ramirez, who repeatedly highlights in his memoir, Mis 43 años en la descubierta, that prior to the 1937 massacre, the binational, bilingual market near La Descubierta was crucial to the local economy and social life of the area. Asian buyers and sellers took an active part in it, and Ramirez also remembers that those who lived on the central portion of the Dominican borderland, where La Descubierta is, enjoyed visiting Port-au-Prince, which they describe as an impressive and bustling city with great shops, markets, and social interactions still unknown in Santo Domingo. So partly was because of the connection, because it was easier to get to Port-au-Prince, but partly was also because Haiti at the time was richer. So what was going on in Port-au-Prince was more exciting than what might have been going on in Santo Domingo at the time. And it's important to remember that because Haiti is always portrayed as the poorer partner in the island, but it was not the case at the time. Across the border, cultural exchanges between the two countries are also brought to the fore by Ramirez's repeated use of Asianism. So in the first page, for example, of this book, when Ramirez talks about his first visit to La Descubierta in 1921, he uses an Asianism, he uses Q, to describe a neighborhood formed by people of the same family. And it's interesting because this, the story that is told in the book is a story that he told his daughter, who wrote it down for him. The fact that he used the Asianism Q without any problem, but the daughter thought that it was necessary for her to put a note explaining what that meant for an audience, which in 2000 was a Dominican audience, gives you a sense of the difference between the two moments in history. When for one person it was perfectly legitimate and perfectly normal to use an Asianism, but for the daughter, years later, it was important to put a note to explain what that meant. La Descubierta, as I said, is in the central part of the borderland. If we turn to the southern and northern portion, we have similar picture as far as linguistic and cultural exchanges, connection, or collaborative linkages are concerned. In the northern province of Monte Cristi, for example, we are told that resided about 39% of Asians living in the Dominican Republic, and 21% of the population of the town of Monte Cristi were considered to be of Asian origin. These demographic figures, however, are quite problematic if one considers that at the time it was not entirely clear how to define what being Asian or Dominican might have meant. Many Asians had lived in the province for a very long time. Many had been born in the area and therefore were, according to the Constitution, the Dominican Constitution, Dominicans. Until 2010, the Dominican Constitution was organized around jus soli, which meant that if you were born in the country, you were Dominican. These ethnic Asians were well integrated into the life of the city. They had incorporated Dominican idioms and habits. Some were artisans, some were doctors who practiced in the area. Many worked in the countryside, cultivated land and looking after fields or livestock. Many wealthy households employed Asian servants. In Memorias de Pedernales, another non-fictional text which describes the way of life in the southern section of the Dominican borderland, we are told that the author's father, Vencedor Bello, spoke Creole fluently, a fact that reaffirms the close relationship between the inhabitants of the borderland. Close relations are also highlighted by one survivor of the 1937 massacre, who lived in the area around Dajabon. In the early 1990s, he explained, the date is 2006 because it was republished, but the interviews took place in the 1990s, 96 I think. He explained to the historians who interviewed him that before the onslaught, although there were two sides, the people were one, united. He uses Creole in this interview because he had been living for more than 50 years in Haiti at the time. There is still a fair amount of debate surrounding what actually triggered the massacre, despite the 1936 agreement and the series of laws which aimed at making border crossing more difficult. In 1937, that is, immediately before the massacre, people still circulated more or less freely between the two countries, whose governments didn't have much control on the borderland on both sides. The Dominican historian Bernardo Vega argued that in the years following 1935, owing to the return to Haiti of tens of thousands of braceros who had been expelled from Cuba, the number of Asian migrants in the Dominican Republic might have risen quite substantially, prompting the Dominican ruling classes to take measures to whiten the nation. Lauren Derby and Richard Turitz, that also Eddie mentioned, agreed that the real aim of the massacre was not only to whiten the nation, but to destroy the frontiers bicultural, bilingual, and transnational Asian Dominican communities. Language is seen to have played an important role in the 1937 massacre. Some historians have reported that in order to identify the victims in the mixed world of the borderland, Dominican soldiers asked their prospective victims to pronounce the word perejil, parsley. There were few physical and cultural markers to separate Asians from Asian Dominicans or Dominicans in the borderland region. It was deemed that Asian Creole native speakers found it difficult to pronounce the R in the Spanish word perejil. If the word came out as Asian, Pezil, or a bastardized Spanish version, the victim was condemned to die. According to Turitz, however, in the fluid world of the borderland, where bilingualism was widespread, as we have seen, the purpose of the perejil test was not to establish provenance beyond any reasonable doubt. Ethnic Asians who had deep roots in the Dominican borderland were in fact able to pronounce perejil as well as natives. This litmus test, he argues, could help only to differentiate recent Asian immigrants from those who were born in the Dominican Republic, who had lived there for a long time and were perfectly assimilated. In other words, he insists the perejil test had more to do with the language of performance than with a purely linguistic issue, Spanish versus Creole. He suggests that it was used to dramatize as incompatible and mutually exclusionary the linguistic and, by extension, cultural peculiarities of Asians and Dominicans. Clearly, however, one thing, the performative aspect, doesn't necessarily exclude the other, the linguistic one. In the silver he describes the 1937 massacre in his Compère Général Soleil, General Son, My Brother, the Haitian writer Jacques-Stephen Alexis seems to ponder on the complex question of language and national identification, when referring to a mortally wounded man who was yelling, Pelehil, 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 therefore obviously mispronouncing it. The protagonist of the novel wonders, was he Haitian or Dominican? Similarly, Amabel, the protagonist of the novel of The Farming of Bones by the Haitian American Edwidge Danticat, tells us that after spending most of her life in the Dominican Republic, she could actually say the word perejil properly if given a chance. She is denied this chance when she is severely beaten up and almost killed by a group of fired-up young Dominicans who attack her brandishing handfuls of parsley sprigs. Here, the perejil test seems to serve no practical purpose, is not even properly conducted. As a matter of fact, before the victim can actually respond and linguistically perform Dominicanness, the thugs stuff the parsley into her mouth and almost choke her to death, performing instead their own version of exclusionary Dominicanness. The novel by the Haitian writer René Philoctet, Le Peuple des Terres Mêlées, which was published in 1989, deals with the question of language repeatedly and creatively, so I will be quoting from it quite a lot. Significantly, the linguistic and performative perejil test here has the scope to highlight unity and solidarity rather than incompatible difference and hostility. Le Peuple des Terres Mêlées, in fact, presents us with a transnational community where people intermarried, traded, had families and friends on the two sides of the border. And we are talking here about the central portion of the borderland, around Elias Piña. Amongst the many characters, we have the lovers of the border, that is, El Mulato Dominicano Pedro Alvarez Brito and his wife Adela, Chiquita Negrita Haitiana. And Philoctet uses Spanish in the test. There are quite a lot of Spanish words, and these denominations are in Spanish, and it is his way of underlining the fact that the languages were used interchangeably. An indication of daily across-the-border exchanges can be found, for example, in the fact that before the massacre, we are told the priest of Elias Piña used to purchase his eggs in Belader, the Dominican sergeant in Banica bought his clarin, which is a kind of moonshine rum, in Montorganisé, and merchants from Himani sold their wares in Fonds Parisien. Strictly speaking, the people of the borderland, we are told, talk to one another neither in Creole nor in Spanish, but in a language that only they can understand, the language of the border, nourished by local custom, history, and the human heart. The novel, in fact, presents us with many frantic attempts by the Dominican people of both lands to teach the Asian people of both lands the proper pronunciation of perejil, a word Philoctet insists that both people of both lands strove desperately to say well, so that one people may not be the other's guilty conscience, but the blazing hearth of their home. Examples abound. Fefa Rodriguez of Dajabon, we are told, nailed it to the lips of Pierre Charmant of Vallières. César Gomez of Himani nestled it between the breast of Rose Antoine of Boucambois, while between two glasses of Bermudez rum, Julian Núñez y Jiménez effed it, handled, and gargled it for his friend Serge Laplanche. In Malpaso Marpaso, the word rises from thousands of Asian and Dominican throats like a slow, thick, heavy incantation. In Pedernales, hundreds of Dominican men and women with jugs of honey and sweet melon juice spend their days doling out the mixture to hundreds of Asians. Lips touched by this drink soften, grow more flexible, and will be able to pronounce the word with ease. The most moving and tender story that Philoctet offers us, however, is the one of two black children, both born in Bauruco, the girl of Dominican origin and the boy of Asian descent. They are respectively 5 and 4 years old and live on the borderland and play on both sides of the border. When the girl realizes that the boy cannot pronounce perejil properly, she makes him rehearse the word over and over again until night falls. They were found the next morning, we are told, holding hands around a bouquet of parsley, and not even the callous border guards had the courage to cut their heads off. Philoctet's exuberant rhythmic prose, I think you had an example, is based on accumulation and multiple variations on the same theme. Here the repetition of the perejil-related rituals highlight the solidarity which bound the people of the borderland, counteracts the repetitiveness with which the perejil test might have been performed by those members of Trujillo's army keen to dramatize time and time again the alleged incompatibility, untransferability, incommunicability, and impermeability of Dominican and Asian cultures. In Le Peuple de Terre Mêlée, we are shown other ways in which the massacre left its mark on language, namely by engendering a distressing suspension of communication and self-expression. In the face of the massacre, we are told words are floundering. The peasants, Urbain and Prospero, are perhaps the best example of the devastating blow that in 1937 Trujillo's divisive ideology landed on the way of life of the borderland. Urbain was probably born in Asian territory, grew up somewhere between the two lands, and lived in Cercado Cercado near Neiva in the Dominican Republic. Prospero was born in Dajabon, but also lived in Cercado Cercado. They cultivated their garden together without worrying whether the corn ripened in Asian territory or the potato flourished in the Dominican Republic. Their 4 wives were devoted to them, and their 28 children played in the same courtyard, but not one of them knew for sure whether Urbain or Prospero was his or her father. We are told, however, that the two friends stopped talking to one another when they realized that death would soon come to sit down between them in the shape of the massacre. At the end of the novel, in the middle of the onslaught, a multitude of people head for Asian soil. These refugees, we are told, are of every color, every walk of life, every belief, every character, every kind of memory and beauty. Here, Philoctete deploys language once again to underline communality. The narrator, in fact, cannot tell, and doesn't care to know, if they are Asians or Dominicans. All he knows is that they have so many things in common, share so many wounds, so many joys, that trying to distinguish between the two peoples violates their tacit understanding to live as one and their dream of creating one people from two lands mixed together. Philoctete's novel, therefore, doesn't limit itself to the important task of describing, reviving, and commemorating the dead, but aims to reassert, strongly and decisively, the necessity for reconciliation and the future of communality. This prompts me to pause for a second to reflect upon an important issue also related to language and reconciliation, namely the fact that the better understanding between the two nations depends also on better access to each other's literature and culture, an access which would be facilitated if the translation of literary but also other kinds of text were better supported, and in some cases conducted with perhaps a more acute sense of responsibility. For example, it is commendable that Philoctete's novel has been translated into Spanish, but the original title, Le Peuple de Terre Mêlée, The People of the Mixed Lands, was changed into Rio Massacre. The same is also valid for the English translation, which has the translation Massacre River. The way in which the translation of the title renames and redefines the geographical area mapped by the novel is problematic in different ways. Firstly, geographically. There is no mention of the Massacre River in Philoctete's novel because it runs more than 100 kilometers north of the town where the novel is set. The river that marks the border by Elias Piña, where the story takes place, is in fact the Artibonite and not the massacre. It is crucial to remember that the river massacre owes its name to the fact that in 1728, when the island was still a Spanish colony, a group of French buccaneers or trespassers was massacred by the Spanish troops. This translation of the title, therefore, due to its connotations and historical resonance, is not only geographically baffling, but also objectionable, because it remaps and predetermines the borderland area as a region of violent interactions rather than sustaining the positive message of Philoctete's novel and Philoctete's title. A remapping of the territory, albeit of a different kind, also played a part in the Dominicanization of the frontier in the aftermath of 1937. As anticipated, most of the killings in 1937 took place in the north of the Dominican borderland, mostly in the area of Dajabon and Montecristi. In the central portion of the borderland, however, the inhabitants were informed that by the end of 1938, all the Asians living in the area would have to relocate in Haiti, as part of a process which became known as el desalojo, or evacuation. In his memoir, Ramirez explains that the majority of those who refused to go were killed. The Dominicanization of the borderland, which followed this evacuation, had a huge impact on the topography of the area. In the Pedernales area, for example, the Haitian name of the hill of Leto was changed to Flor de Oro. Marozó became Ángel Feliz, Sabambon was substituted by Sabana Real, Toussaint by Grenada. Renaming is obviously a fundamental component of any form of colonization, since it has the function of erasing any trace of previous occupants or of a previous history. Significantly, Ramirez remembers that one of the names chosen for another colony in the area was Tierra Virgen, Virgin Land. Far from being a never previously inhabited virgin land, however, this was clearly a place which used to belong to Haitians. Ramirez recounts that he found stoves left behind by the Haitians during El Desalojo. He also enjoyed the ripe fruits from trees that had been planted there before the evacuation and that nobody had picked since the Haitian had left. Also on the other side of the border, new communities were being created to host those who had to relocate in Haiti in the aftermath of the massacre. In Laissez-moi la colère, the Haitian writer Anthony Lespès exposes the unsatisfactory conditions in the Haitian agricultural colony of Biligi. The novel, written in the third person, includes very harrowing first-person accounts of the killings which traumatized all the survivors of the 1937 massacres. Yet, in spite of their terrible experiences, we are told that many of them eventually decided to go back to the Dominican Republic. Their desire to return is easy to understand if one considers that many had lived there for a very long time. In some cases, we are told more than 30 years. Some were even born there. Their identification with the Dominican Republic is made explicit in the novel by the fact that when they first arrived in Biligi, they spoke Spanish among themselves. Some continued to do so a year or two after their arrival, a sign that they struggled to identify themselves as Asian. This is one of the many quotations that you can look at it. You can see the Spanish and the French are on the same page. The situation illustrated by Lespès resonates with some of the experiences of those who have been deported to Haiti from the Dominican Republic in the aftermath of the 23rd of September 2013 ruling of the Dominican Constitutional Court, which ordered that all birth registries from 1929 should be audited for people who had been allegedly wrongly registered as Dominican citizens. As a result of this sentence and the many shortfalls of the complex administrative and legal processes it triggered for those who wanted their Dominican nationality to be confirmed or their status as migrants to be regularized, a very large number of people have been left officially stateless and at risk of being deported to Haiti, a country that many of them have never seen. Many have already been relocated to makeshift camps on the other side of the border. Some of the pictures taken in 2016 by Valérie Berzouil in a refugee camp near Anse-Pitre illustrate their dire condition. As in Lespès's novel, it is important to point out that many of the people in this camp cannot speak Creole, have no relatives left in Haiti, and many of them are in possession of Dominican documents. My next test, the 2015 documentary Citizens of Nowhere, directed by Régis Cousseau and Nicolas Alexandre Tremblay, also deals with the consequences of the 2013 ruling. One of the interviewees, the old Delinois, and this chimes with what Eddie was saying a minute ago, significantly speaks only Spanish during his interview. This fact reaffirms both his identification with the country that by now he considers his own and his right to stay in the Dominican Republic. He recounts directly to the camera how he arrived in the Dominican Republic to work in the cane fields when he was 11 and Trujillo was still in power. He probably arrived with workers who were recruited by the Haitian government and sent over to work in the Dominican Republic in the aftermath of an agreement made in 1952, Eddie was talking about it, between Trujillo and the then dictator of Haiti, François Duvalier, who profited from this market. It wasn't just the Dominican. It was both governments profiting from sending these workers. What is important here is that Delinois did not enter the country illegally. Two other interviewees, much younger, Roberto and Anderson, are two Dominicans of Asian descent, whose parents also spent their lives working in the cane fields. They explained that the 2013 ruling has stripped them of their nationality, preventing them from going to university or finding a job. The ruling, they continue, also made them vulnerable to expulsion from the country of their birth which is also the only country they've ever known. They proudly repeat over and over again that despite the fact that they cannot get a birth certificate or a cedula, which is the Dominican identity card, and they cannot get it because of their parents' irregular status, they feel Dominican and are Dominicans. Roberto and Anderson are very well aware that they are actively being transformed into the others against whom ultranationalistic exclusionary discourses encourage Dominicans to imagine both themselves and their nation. They resort both to the language of music and to the only language they know, Dominican Spanish, to refute not only their alleged foreignness, but also their non-existence. As we see them perform their own songs in public spaces in order to raise awareness of and articulate resistance against the injustice perpetrated against people like them by the 2013 ruling, they also lament that the ruling made them feel as if they do not exist, as if they were not part of this world. This is not entirely an exaggeration if one considers that the Dominican journalist Juan Bolivar Diaz has referred to the deep-rooted and ongoing process of discrimination against Dominicans of Asian descent as civil genocide. Bolivar's civil genocide clearly differs from the 1937 massacre in its modalities. It is done through administrative bureaucracy rather than military intervention, but not in its ruthlessness. Moreover, this genocide has been a fairly protracted process. The September 2013 ruling is not the first attempt to denationalize Dominican citizens of Asian descent. Dominican authorities, in fact, have routinely resorted to administrative procedures to remove Dominican nationality from Dominican citizens of Asian descent. Over the years, they've also conducted arbitrary deportations and expulsions. Roberto's and Anderson's decision to respond to this attack with their music and lyrics is one way to resort to different forms of language in order to express one's views on this topic. Other artists have imagined and explored other creative ways to do so, and I will conclude by looking at some of the different ways in which languages, as well as different forms of language, have recently been deployed against discrimination. In 2005, as part of a performance entitled Lo que dice la piel, the Dominican artist David Perez Carmadavis asked a person of Asian descent to write his views on the socio-political conflict between Haiti and the Dominican Republic. This person's words were then tattooed onto Carmadavis' arm, and as a result, his body became the medium of communication between the two nations and the two languages. The words Carmadavis had tattooed on his arm were business gouvernement bénéfice gouvernement, that is, the business of the government benefits the government. A clear indictment of the collusion between government and dominant classes in the exploitation of poor Asian migrants and Asian Dominicans made vulnerable by the Dominican government's unwillingness to recognize them as citizens. It is significant that the language in which the Asian person expresses his ideas is Asian Creole, because by foregrounding Creole, Carmadavis is embracing, rather than demonizing, the diversity that characterizes the two parts of the island, and which ultranationalistic discourses present instead as incommensurable and irreconcilable differences. Carmadavis has also explored other forms of language and communication to put his point across. As we have seen since 2014, following the 2013 sentence's chaotic aftermath, some Dominicans of Asian descent were beginning to be relocated in precarious camps on the Asian side of the border. At that time, Carmadavis produced the performance Comedor Familiar, family meal or family dining room. Comedor Familiar is informed by the desire to look for similarities rather than positing incompatible differences, and actively identifies the borderland as a place which can play a decisive role in promoting the development of a national identity in relation with, and not in opposition to, one's neighbors. The language of choice here is the language of cooking. Carmadavis, in fact, is also a trained chef. For this performance, Carmadavis placed a dining table straddling a small stream on the borderline between Haiti and the Dominican Republic, a visual reminder that the frontier often runs alongside the river, the massacre in the north, the Artibonite in the middle, and the Pedernales in the south. Then, equipped with a cooking stove, Carmadavis prepared a delicious lunch for a nearby family with a Dominican father, an Asian mother, and an Asian Dominican child. The meal Carmadavis had prepared and served was a gastronomical fusion of ingredients and dishes typical of both nations. This is the menu, if you want to have a look. What is interesting about this performance is this detail here. If you look at the table carefully, you will see that one of the legs of the table is missing. The table only has 3 legs, and this was done to indicate the extreme precariousness of the situation of this family. In the immediate aftermath of the 2013 ruling, therefore, Karmadavis Comedor Familiar was a timely but ultimately hopeful work. As the epigraph to the performance explains, when dialogue is no longer possible, what still exists is the mystery of hope. The last performance I would like to look at briefly today is Karmadavis' El Vecino. This performance foregrounds the importance of yet another type of language, namely the silent language of plants. For this performance, Karmadavis illegally introduced in Haiti a dozen different plants. They were transported en bas-file, hidden behind, doing the opposite trajectory of people who run, going to the Dominican Republic en bas-file. It took the plants at the back of a truck en bas-file into Haiti, and they were transplanted in Parc Marc-Tissan in Port-au-Prince. There we go. These Dominican trees will grow in Haiti and produce seeds, which one day Karmadavis plans to replant in the Dominican Republic in order to perpetuate his cross-pollination experiment. In his novel, Philoctete II highlighted how local flora and fauna fully participated in the communality of the borderland and in its peculiar form of intercommunication. When the threat of the massacre approached, we are told mountains, flowers, insects, rivers and streams, rodents, plains, birds, Dominicans and Asians spoke to one another in a language only they can understand, the language of the border. Plants, some believe, are sophisticated organisms able to respond to environmental stimuli and play an active role in their own survival and the survival of those around them. Karmadavis, and this will be my very last point, here posits the island as an ecosystem in which cross-fertilization plays a crucial part and reinforces the need to keep across-the-border communication going in all the possible ways. Thanks very much.